Hi, this is Kirby Sommers for the Epstein Project podcast. And today, my co host is back, Jeremy Rothe-Kushel. Jeremy, can you hear me?
I can hear you so loud and clear, Kirby. It's wonderful.
That's because I went and I got a new microphone, like you suggested.
Very
So,
cool.
thank you for the guidance. And thank you for coming on during a holiday. The day after Thanksgiving is not necessarily, but we are pre Ghislaine Maxwell. On Monday is the trial of the century. So I first want to ask everyone to please like the video and please subscribe. And then Jeremy, I want to ask you if you could just remind everyone what Ghislaine Maxwell is being accused of.
Yes, and she was charged for a series of alleged actions over the course of from 1994 to 2001. Four different alleged victims in New York, Florida, and New Mexico, and the reporting on it was that Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested and charged with enticing a minor to travel to engage in criminal sexual activity, transporting a minor with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, conspiracy to commit both of those offenses, and perjury in connection with a sworn deposition.
Any other person would probably do 40 to 80 years, but this is Ghislaine Maxwell. And frankly, I think it could go in any direction. She could decide to plea at the last minute. She has attempted to be released on bail multiple times with no success. And I don't know if you've heard this, but her family and her attorneys have appealed to the United Nations to help them get their innocent Ghislaine out of jail so that she can go home. So they've tried everything. But it does begin on Monday. Meanwhile, I just want to ask you what your thoughts are on the fact that Judith Nathan has been selected by Joe Biden for a promotion. And what do you think of the timing and what do you think of the promotion?
The timing just seems the timing itself seems judicially inappropriate, actually, at the very least, in terms of one of, if not the biggest anticipated trial of this century. Right as it's getting going, the announcement that Judith Nathan is going to be promoted directly by the President of the United States of America. And so the appearance is inappropriate on the surface, I would say. I don't know how it plays out, but I imagine we'll talk also about the rulings by Judge Nathan to not deal with the Epstein agreement, how all of this begins to play out. I imagine she will continue to handle the trial on the surface in a way that seems fairly appropriate, but with this promotion in the background sitting there, I think the question is begged about what the reason for the timing is on that.
Yeah, I was immediately very suspicious because in Alexander Acosta's situation, he was thanked a couple of years after the fact, so it wasn't really made obvious. People who go along with the system tend to be promoted. That is what we have seen and what has been really exposed really quite well, I believe, if anything has been exposed with the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell trafficking ring and this case is that people get promoted. However, you did mention the fact that Judge Nathan has basically in one of the motions before the court instructed Ghislaine Maxwell's attorneys that they cannot bring up Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement. So on the surface, as you always so correctly point out, because there are two levels to this, there's superficial and then what's really going on. So on the surface, if Judge Nathan has told Ghislaine Maxwell's attorneys, you cannot bring up Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement. Some people are going, hooray, hooray, because all along from the day that she pled innocent, on July 14th, the very first time she appeared before Judge Nathan and requested to go home. And, it was like, what are you, guilty, not guilty? She's like, not guilty. But her attorneys at the time suggested that she should be allowed to go home based on Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement. However, now going to the level, that we live on, which is beneath the surface. Beneath the surface, the disallowance of the bringing up Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement during this trial also suggests to me that they're going to keep that door open where those big names live. What's your take on that?
Very much so. And I think your analysis of the two layers of this is crucial, actually. And the two layers, or maybe are not even just the overt versus the covert, but also what might be immediately apparently beneficial to Ghislaine Maxwell in her immediate case versus what's actually good for the entire network that she represents in many ways. And so Judge Nathan's ruling to remove any discussion of the non-prosecution agreement may on the surface look like it goes against helping Ghislaine Maxwell in the immediate, and that she would allege that she's covered by it and all of that. What it really does, very obviously, is prevent any discussion of who then was needed to be beyond Ghislaine Maxwell, who then needed to be protected in terms of this non-prosecution agreement, and how pervasive the network really was. And in a certain parallel, it seems related to even the civil focus on someone like Prince Andrew, rather than some of our more domestic elements who have been alleged to have been directly involved in this very same network, in terms of people like the former head of the Department of Energy, Bill Richardson, who, remember, was also the governor of New Mexico in relationship to the Epstein's Zorro Ranch. But I would also remind folks that the Department of Energy that Bill Richardson was in charge of is also where the nuclear weapons of the United States, the DOE, is primarily responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance and the protection of the nuclear stockpile. And so in the background of Robert Maxwell and Promise and all of that, and all of those kinds of long historical pushes by that aspect of the Israeli security state in terms of their interest in nuclear weapons and components and that kind of espionage and trucking and bartering and exfiltrating American nuclear secrets and materials to Israel, you got to know that someone like Bill Richardson, as both governor of New Mexico, where all of these significant nuclear laboratories are, but also then the head of the former head of the Department of Energy in control of the nuclear stockpile, ultimately, that a focus towards Prince Andrew, who, yes, he's an important figure. It's beyond just royal gossip, because he's also an important weapons procurer in terms of the UK. But just the fact that he's in the UK, he's royal, and all of that puts a certain aura of gossip and basically a firewall of a sense that anything real and substantial is going to happen in terms of American accountability, rather than focusing on some people like a Bill Richardson, and then even someone like George Mitchell, who was also mentioned, who was the key diplomat in the sphere of the Israel-Palestine, the Middle East more broadly, I think under the Clinton administration.
You make a very valid point, and I think that up until you said this, I myself am watching this so closely that sometimes you have to step back in order to see a broader picture. And it was just at this moment that I stepped back, as you mentioned, Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew has been in all of mainstream media. Prince Andrew has been discussed by all of the attorneys. Prince Andrew has pretty much dominated our lives for a couple of years, and it's interesting, and I mean it did happen coincidentally because it's my understanding that Virginia did not want to sue, that she and her attorney, David Boies, attempted for 5 years to get Prince Andrew to settle this out of court. But because in her case in New York City, she was running against the clock for the Child Victims Rights Act, she had to act pretty much. I think it was before the weekend that she filed um, the civil lawsuit. This said, the timing could not have been better because Ghislaine Maxwell's case is happening at the same time, so that the individuals who were really American major political names, you have former President Bill Clinton, you have now former President Donald Trump, there was even former President George W. Bush. You have all of these major names that Virginia Giuffre has alleged, including Alan Dershowitz, Steven Pinker, I believe. The list is endless. But no one is talking about them. And so it would seem to me, again, going back to our hidden level, that this is an intentional distraction. I mean, it just sounds to me like it's an intentional distraction.
It would seem like that, and I forget what that phrase is about, that if they can get you asking the wrong questions, it doesn't matter what the answers are. And so that's one macro level of understanding disinformation, counterintelligence operations that are really crucial, I think, right now, especially as the trial is about to commence and all of the surrounding media around the trial, to begin to really step back and think about what are the right questions, what are the areas of inquiry that some may not want us to go into. And there's that other infamous statement about how real journalism is that which makes the powerful uncomfortable. Everything else is PR, public relations. And as we dissected last time, sometimes public relations as journalism is just very, very blatant and obvious. In the case of someone like Daphne Barak, direct relation to former Prime Minister of Israel and former head of Israeli military intelligence and former Israeli defense, quote unquote, minister Ehud Barak, directly connected closely to the Epstein network, and Daphne Barak writing quote unquote journalistic pieces about this. So that's just an indicator of how direct quote unquote journalism or media can actually operate as public relations. But even when you have journalistic pieces that look like they're exposing some aspect, often if you take a step back, you can analyze the landscape as, oh, this is actually potentially a red herring of some sort. It's meant to push our attention away from maybe the higher levels of power dynamics that are seeking to hide behind these lower level players.
Yeah, I think Daphne Barak must listen to our podcast because she blocked me immediately afterwards. As did the Maxwell family with their Real Galen Twitter account. They'll block me, then they'll unblock me. I guess they don't want you to miss my tweets. But there are other ways to get around that, which, for a family of spies leaves me speechless how clueless these people are. In any event, I do want to say that a few of my friends who are well-educated people and who are sophisticated and who a few of them have said, I get all of my news from mainstream media, and it kind of makes me want to hit my head against a wall.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
you cannot say that without having some knowledge that it's not news. Not when you have someone, let's say, as like Daphne Barak, where it's so obvious it's not news. And we don't no longer really have like one of our favorite guys who you mentioned before we got on the air, and I hope you bring him up again, Seymour Hersh. I mean, we have Doug Valentine, who's been reduced to sitting on the sidelines. He would have been the next Cy Hirsch, but mainstream media would not allow this, right? So,
It's a good point. And there's a part of it which is true in terms of that a lot of the basic forensics, the basic data, the basic journalistic data that people like us use in part to do an analysis of these networks of power does come from mainstream media. And someone like Seymour Hersh is a crucial example for understanding that. And you've explained multiple times about how he was crucial to first, in a mainstream way, uncovering that Robert Maxwell was acting as an agent of espionage for Israel. And it's also the case that you're also correct that there really are not Seymour Hersh's in the mainstream media anymore. So that's also part of the dynamics. But even though there's no Seymour Hersh's really operating at that scale in terms of the long form, the really in-depth muckraking of serious stories, there's some that do a part of that. Even in the lighter forms of uncovering that sometimes comes into the mainstream media, there is really crucial information, but it really needs to then be coupled with the kind of analysis that you do, which then includes reading previous books on the matter, uncovering documents, legal documents, using the legal documents, but then also developing sources in addition to what's been already put out by what's ultimately at the very best a limited hangout by the mainstream journalists. And then one last thing that I can think of is that there's the author Seth Abramson, who talked about how he was doing meta journalism in relationship to something like the global collusion operation behind the Donald Trump operation, which was not just Trump Russia, but was also very Middle Eastern and very Israeli, and with a whole slew of operatives that seemed to tie into the Epstein network also. And what he did was take these disparate mainstream news articles that would give you part of the information and then use those to actually create a coherent analysis and narrative of what actually went on. And so that's one way of using mainstream media, but I think one must go even beyond that if you really want to get to the deep truth of some of these really high level power networks, where you actually somehow figure out a way to peer beyond the scenes. And then my final point in terms of the danger of relying too heavily on mainstream media is this, just returning back to what I originally said, is that it may be that we've been prompted to head in the wrong direction and ask the wrong questions, or at the very least limit the depth of the questions we're willing to ask out in public in order to go up the chain of command, let's say, in terms of an analysis of these networks of power. For example, even just the question of limiting the analysis to Epstein and Maxwell will potentially make sure that names like Wexner, and then by extension and up the chain names like Rickless, will be off the table, where most Americans haven't even heard those names, Wexner first and then Rickless especially, and they're such crucial players to this decades long network that stands behind and is being protected by these very, very myopic focus on this very specific set of limited crimes that Maxwell is being accused of.
Yes. Mainstream media is using a word that was used during the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And they're stating that she is a patsy, and that she is and like, it is, it's funny, but I would venture to say that people who read and absorb mainstream media are not inclined. I mean, I think that people like us and our followers and people who are really gung-ho about finding out the truth and ending this horrific crime of, human trafficking and all of the other crimes that it includes, right? It includes drugs, it includes wars, it includes torture, it includes money laundering, it includes uh, spying on private citizens. I mean, the list is endless. It includes murder, I am sure. So that for them to call her a patsy, uh, to me, what this is telling me is that not only did we already have an inkling that we are living in our generation's number one cover up, but that they're going to stick to this. When I tuned in before you and I began our show today, and I listened to some talking heads, I won't mention their names because I don't want to embarrass them, but they're basically just giving themselves excuses as to why they had not been following the Epstein story. They had not written about it, and they had not spoken about it. And of course, everything is back to, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's. No, you were being silent because you were not allowed to talk about it, because you depend on your check and you don't want to go off on your own and do the right thing. That's really why. But they're not really following this story. I don't know if you've ever come across anything saying, because I'm including what I'm about to tell you in my sequel to Ghislaine Maxwell, an unauthorized biography, which is called, very appropriately, Ghislaine Maxwell Blackmail. But Ghislaine Maxwell lied about not knowing anything about her father, Robert Maxwell's massive frauds. Today, she is lying about not knowing anything about Jeffrey Epstein's international trafficking ring. So either we have to assume she's either stupid or she's lying. And I tend to believe she's lying. What say you?
Well, yeah, I mean, she's accused of, one of her charges, as you point out, is perjury,
Yeah,
being
that's right.
accused of lying. And depositions are, they're basically the same as being on the stand. You take an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And let's note that phrasing, how important that is in terms of what it means about what is actually one of the goals of the legal process. There's these twin roads of the legal process that, when it's operating in full good faith, it's meant to fulfill. One of them is justice. And there's multiple parts of justice that we won't get into right now. But the other part of it is the truth, and that even things like legal documents, legal transcripts, trial transcripts, those become very, very important source material for actually then doing historical analysis after the fact. And a lot of that is based upon this question of testimony, testifying. testifying, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. And so there's a lot to that that's packed into it. It's not just the truth, it's saying the whole truth. So any aspect of withholding or a small fib, all of that is against it's basically becomes illegal once you've taken that oath. And so Maxwell is accused of lying under oath, which is a really crucial thing to consider, because it then begins to impeach her credibility in terms of if when she speaks on her own behalf potentially. And as you point out, we're also then dealing with an apparent intergenerational family of spies. And everyone knows that if you're an intelligence operative, then that's a key piece of what you learn to do. You learn to lie, you learn to deceive, and there's different reasons why you might have to do that. They may be that you're working on what you believe is someone's national security, that you need to get in order to get information. But also then when you bring in your second book here in terms of Ghislaine Maxwell, blackmail, that then becomes a crucial piece too, is the nature of deception in relationship of covering up a blackmail operation. And so I would assert that Ghislaine Maxwell is very likely long practiced at lying, deceiving, cloaking under purposeful deception as a part and parcel of her espionage training, very likely.
Yeah, in fact, I was writing a segment to my book today where I cover that specifically, because there were some things that were reported about after her father died, which were reported by various sources, and then she just called a friend, and I'm including this article where she calls a friend and she kind of says, "No, I didn't do X, Y, and Z." But to get back to Judge Nathan, who, by the way, most people like, because if she hasn't granted Ghislaine Maxwell a get out of jail card, I mean, and it's really just denying bail. Everyone sees her as doing a great job, but to your point regarding the two perjury charges, most people are unaware that Judge Nathan, in a previous, the Maxwell family and Ghislaine Maxwell and her attorneys have pretty much been trying this case out of court before the court date, from the time that she appeared the first time requesting to be allowed to go home. So in one of these motions filed before the court, it was requested that the two charges for perjury be separate from these other charges for trafficking and transporting a minor. And Judge Nathan agreed. And that was another kind of patsy moment for me. It was like, oh, okay, so now we can't talk during this trial. We cannot talk or bring up the fact that she's perjured herself, which would indicate what you just so clearly described, that she is not credible.
Yes, and it's an issue. It's a big issue, and I know why we want to there to be actors of good faith who are going to hold people accountable, not only in this case, but on this whole series of deep incidents that we've experienced in terms of our experience here in the United States of America. You mentioned the Kennedy assassination. There would have been a hope that there would have been some inside of the justice system or in the high levels of politics that understood that rooting out that level of corruption, where you could have the murder of a president by high level elements both within and outside of the country, that would benefit the national security to root that kind of thing out, but it doesn't happen. And so I think we have to be open to the possibility that although we're not going to see someone like Joe Biden do a Donald Trump and wish Ghislaine Maxwell well in front of the entire world, Biden himself is obviously implicated in aspects of this network, the relationship with Rickless way back, but then also this announcement of Judge Nathan's promotion is a maybe a more subtle diplomatic potential approach to the Trump statement of "I wish her well." In this case, I wish this trial in its limited scope be smooth enough so that we can put this entire nature of the inquiry into this larger network that I'm directly connected to bed.
Yes, not one journalist has written about Antony Blinken after he has been exposed by moi as being a friend, a family friend of Ghislaine Maxwell, which is interesting because, especially on the heels of Joe Biden um, basically saying, okay, we're going to put Judith Nathan on the Second Circuit, which is just one level beneath the highest court in the land. This is a big thank you. Uh, and also the timing of this trial is suspicious to me. So, if I have three areas that are like kind of with a bright red flashing light that will not go off, this would be the third one. And it is that during the Christmas holiday, which is in the middle of the trial, technically, well, not the middle, but toward the end, because the trial is expected to last until January 6th. The jury cannot be tainted. However, we are going to have a Christmas recess, at which point the jurors will be with their family or their friends or their loved ones, and they probably will hear information about the jury or what's going on or the trial. And so what happens when they go back to court? Well, a mistrial can easily, it's just, there's so many ways that this can go like just fall apart, that it's almost like, why are they even bothering if it's not to appease us?
Yeah, and the whole slew of possibilities here are very likely being played. It's game theory at some level, I would imagine, where there are multiple options and multiple strategies being run at once. And there's the whole array of things that Ghislaine herself is doing in terms of what you were telling me about, in terms of she has her new imaginary friend. So there's a whole pathway that she's starting to lead down towards the potential playing around on the edges of driven to insanity kind of scenario. Then there's this whole thing that you mentioned about this full court media press being driven by her family at the same time as then there is the setup to claim that Ghislaine has been tried in the media first, and thus that ruins the integrity of the trial ultimately. So they're complaining about what they're involved in ultimately at some level, and so all of this together seems like they're playing on multiple levels at the same time. And then finally is this the temporal aspect of this that you picked up on that I think is crucial, and especially in terms of the wake of these other big national trials, from Rittenhouse to the killers of Arbery, that where it was being live broadcast because those were state cases. Now this is a federal case, so there's not going to be, as people have already noticed, there's no pictures inside the courtroom. There's not going to be live video. And then also in terms of this holiday season, I believe, for we Jews who celebrate Hanukkah, it starts on this coming Monday, I believe, November the 29th. And then this trial, trial, as you point out, will go through towards the Christmas holiday, and a perfect time to not only, as you say, potentially send a jury home to be potentially prejudiced in a way that could then be pointed at by Ghislaine's representation, but also similarly to dumping big damning news stories on a Friday evening. This seems to be the Friday evening of the year in terms of this late November into December holiday season.
That's a good point. I do find it so incredibly blatant that her family goes on a public relations campaign that we, the public, know she's retained public relations companies and persons, that and then her attorneys claim that she will not get a fair trial because there's too much media attention. Well, hello, who's chasing who? Because nobody was really paying attention to Ghislaine Maxwell other than Ghislaine Maxwell, and until her brother started appearing on every mainstream media televised situation, and having his friends like Daphne Barak interview him for the Daily Mail, even though Jordy Gregg has had to step down the day after. Yeah, another guy bites the dust. I guess nobody wants to bite Ghislaine Maxwell anymore. But she they're covering every single base, so they create a problem where there was no problem before, because we were all complaining mainstream media is MIA with Ghislaine Maxwell. But in steps the Maxwell family, the siblings, and there are stories, like crazy stories, like Ghislaine is wonderful and they want to teach people how to cook. And then of course we had the unfortunate, I won't even mention it, but it's just, but Ghislaine Maxwell, aside from the fact that she has attempted to portray the guards, and by the way, I went to the jail. I met some of the guards because I went and I took copies of my book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography. I had my friend kind of have the camera snapping away at my offering these books for free to the guards. And you know what? Those guards, very nice people. I spoke to several of them, very nice people. Now, I will, full disclosure, they're not allowed to take a present from me. So but I'm sure they went and bought the book. But they were not allowed to take presents, and that's fine.
So
However,
they acted appropriately in that case in terms of receiving you. Yeah.
I have to say that not only did they act appropriately, because one of them was like already in her car when I approached her, and she could have easily just taken the book, which I was offering her for free, but she didn't, and no one would have necessarily seen her, right? It's not like, but they were very nice and kind, and they didn't have to be. They could have told me, leave, we see your male friend over there taking pictures of all of us. They could have done anything, but they were very kind. And so I just found it interesting that here are these people working in, because when it's, you could, from the jail, there's like a middle part that's open, that's sort of just you can hear everything that's going on inside. So there's a lot of noise, as if you really are in a madhouse. So it's only like barred off, and maybe with the, what do you call it, the wiring, that they are exposed, that these guards who are normal people who go home to their families at the end of their 8-hour shift or whatever, however long they work, that they're in this atmosphere that is not comfortable, let's say, and that they could retain their ability to be kind to me, a stranger. They didn't expect me, they don't know me, I don't know them. I found that to be very telling, when Ghislaine has been doing everything to say that they are unkind and that they mistreat her. Well, in a news story, now she is completely 180 that, because she's now revealing that she plays hide and seek with the prison guards, and she has an imaginary friend to keep her company while awaiting her trial for sex trafficking, and that she's given her imaginary friend uh, a name. Now, this name is very unusual, and it's A17. And you and I spoke about this before we started this, and you're so ding, ding, ding on to everything that you said it was what?
It appears to be a code, and this is one thing that you pointed out too, that it looks like the way that Maxwell uses the mainstream media, even going back to things like the infamous photo of her at the In-N-Out Burger in Southern California, where she is also reading a book that is by Ted Gupp, and it's about the life and death or honor of CIA agents. That there's something implied that she's sending messages out, probably on many levels, in terms of her interaction with the mainstream media, as well as playing psychological operations in terms of where she is and all of that. And so I imagine something like A17 is obviously, there's some other kind of information that is being worked via that.
No, I agree. I think A17 stands for someone or something. Um, it amazes me that she's allowed to do these antics, which if I were a victim of Ghislaine Maxwell and or Jeffrey Epstein, it would cut me. It would be re-traumatizing. It's already traumatizing to all of us who have not been her direct victims on just the humanity level. But for her to be able to pretty much have all of mainstream media at her beck and call, to make ridiculous statements that are childish, untrue, and it's a waste of time. And for mainstream media to then regurgitate this nonsense, it's insulting. And but for the victims, it has to be brutal. Um, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
I can't even. It's just very upsetting. So before I let you get back to your vacation, what are your thoughts? I mean, what do you think is going to happen with the Ghislaine Maxwell trial we've been waiting for?
Uh, Part of me thinks that it's potentially predestined to go very smoothly and very controlled and contained, and there would be an outcome of some of the charges she might be found guilty on, but with a much more minor sentence. But part of me also begins to sense that with all of these things that we've discussed today that are surrounding it, and even the things in terms of the promotion of Judge Nathan that is being proposed, that there might be very big chaos warfare dynamics in play here to even disrupt a potential putting this whole thing to bed via a smooth trial of these very serious but also very contained charges, both in terms of scope in relationship to how large a scale of sex trafficking and blackmail operation this really was, but also in terms of time, where it's truncated into a scope of not even a decade of these incidents, whereas we know that this took place over multi-decades. So I get a sense that there are these dynamics to potentially break this thing apart in a very chaotic way, for it not even to fully resolve. But I could also see it going smoothly on track with a strong limitation of the public inquiry and the media analysis surrounding it, and then an end result that can end up putting this whole thing to bed, as the attempt may be, while also Ghislaine not facing the full justice of even what these charges would necessitate.
Right. In the end, do you see her doing time? Before you answer, I'm going to say that I suspect that perhaps what will happen to Ghislaine Maxwell, and I hope I'm wrong, is that when all is said and done, the judge will turn around and whatever happens, it will be well, for time served, you can go home.
I was
But
thinking time served would be definitely a
yeah,
key piece of this.
and sometimes they can say time served plus another 6 months. But then if she goes home, Scott Borgerson has already been cited with another woman, so she doesn't have him anymore. He didn't waste any time finding another girlfriend. So maybe he'll leave with her $25 million. Who knows?
What's At some point we should do a full analysis of all of the spouses actually of the Maxwell sisters. That's a whole other
Yeah,
terrain, and we could then re-include Borgerson, whatever his
that's a good idea.
current status may be in relationship to Ghislaine.
That is an excellent idea. Okay, well, that gives us food for thought for another show. Well, Jeremy, I am so happy that you were able to break away from Thanksgiving dinner and sit here with me on my new mic and talk to everyone right before really the most important trial I think that our generation has looked at, with regard to really horrific things against children. So with that, I'm going to thank you and ask you if there's any parting thought that you want to leave with everyone.
Well, I just want to say it was wonderful to rejoin you, and I hope everybody out there is having warm holidays and celebrating the blessing of life itself. And then may we continue the fight of using truth towards justice. And I hope we get to do this again soon.
That's a great way of doing it. Okay, truth for justice, and justice for truth. All right, it's Kirby Sommers and Jeremy Rothe-Kushel for the Epstein Project podcast. Thank you, everybody.
Bye bye.